It wasn't like we hadn't been camping before. We'd spent countless weekends in the wild, but this spot in the woods was new to us. Our usual group of 5 was along for the trip. John and Benny, experienced hunters who always had a swagger about them, and Pete and Tom. Good friends, though their idea of outdoor adventure was more about a backyard barbecue than roughing it. Then there was me, the one telling this story, the one narrating our adventure. As the summer sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky was painted with reds and golds as we drove into the forest. The land was pure wilderness, filled with towering pines and untouched groves, their shadows stretching as the daylight faded. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a scent only those who truly appreciated nature could understand. There was excitement in the air, mingling with the scent of our old truck as we prepared for a weekend of hunting and fun. Laughter filled the truck as Benny spun wild stories about the giant bucks he'd bagged, while Tom regaled us with his latest escapade with a city girl, making us laugh so hard we nearly lost our breath. When we arrived, we found a perfect spot for our camp, a clearing surrounded by trees. It had that untouched beauty that made it feel like we were the first ones to discover it. We set up our 7-man tent, falling into our routine with ease. Despite the jokes and jabs, the tent was up by 6, and the smell of pork and beans cooking over the fire filled the air. We gathered around the fire, swapping stories and reliving old memories. Hunting trips were never just about the hunt. It was about the camaraderie, the shared silence in the woods, and the tales we'd tell around the campfire that always brought us back. As night fell, John and Benny, eager as ever, announced they were going hunting. The forest felt different by night, mysterious, almost intimidating. Benny lent me his old rifle, but I decided not to join them. The thought of walking through those dark woods, especially with the gleam in Benny's eyes when he spoke of nocturnal hunting, made me uneasy. As they disappeared into the thick trees, rifles and headlamps in hand, the campsite fell into an eerie silence. The rest of us huddled in the tent, voices lowered, the shadows of the woods making us uneasy. I remember thinking about how nature, so beautiful by day, could hold so many secrets in its depths. Little did I know, the forest was about to reveal one of its darkest secrets, a terrifying red-eyed creature that would change everything. The night felt heavy, the canopy of stars obscured by thick leaves. Inside the tent, we swapped more stories. Pete had just finished a tale about an adventure in Costa Rica, involving a bartender, a monkey, and way too many drinks, when we heard something. Frantic footsteps and hurried breaths cut through the stillness of the forest. The flap of the tent flew open, and in burst John and Benny, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They collapsed onto the sleeping bags, breathing heavily as if they'd just run a marathon. I quickly unzipped the tent flap, the cool air rushing in as they spoke in rushed, panicked breaths. Benny, his voice shaking, managed to say, "We finished shooting as it got dark." John was packing up his rifle, and I was taking one last look when I saw it. A deer. His eyes were wide, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "A deer?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. Benny nodded. Its eyes were glowing red. I shot, but it didn't fall. Then it charged at us, and we ran. I turned to John, who was silent, his gaze fixed on the floor of the tent. His knuckles were white as he gripped his knees. "I didn't see it until it came at us," he whispered. "Just those red eyes." A chill ran down my spine. My hand instinctively reached for Benny's rifle, its familiar weight offering little comfort. "We'll go back tomorrow," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. That night, sleep was hard to come by. Every rustle of leaves, every sigh of the wind seemed like a threat. The image of those red eyes haunted me, the forest now holding a terrifying secret. It was a secret that would linger with us into the morning, a warning of horrors yet to come. Sleep was fitful, the memory of those glowing eyes fresh in our minds. The sun's rise was a relief, its warmth pushing away some of the fear from the night. We had made a pact to leave, but with each step into the woods, we could feel the unease growing. The forest in daylight seemed normal, but the sense of dread lingered. We eventually found Benny's abandoned rifle, lying in the dirt. Relief washed over him as he picked it up and checked it, but then his face went pale. "Look at the carving on the butt," I said, pointing it out. It was a simple engraving, but the scene depicted made my blood run cold. Two men, one with a rifle and the other looking down his scope. It was unmistakable. It was us. "That's us," John whispered, his face draining of color. Benny didn't say anything, but the silent acknowledgement of our worst fear was enough. Later, we tried to regain some sense of normalcy by hunting in the afternoon, but it wasn't the same. The thrill of the hunt had been replaced with a lingering sense of dread. By nightfall, we were back at camp, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the usual jokes and laughter felt hollow, forced. We couldn't escape the memory of the glowing red eyes. Even as we huddled close to the campfire, its warmth offering only a small comfort, we couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in us. The forest had shared its secret, and we couldn't forget it. The next morning, we were eager to leave. The forest, once a place of adventure, had become a place of nightmares. By mid-morning, we had packed up and began our walk back to the car. We barely made it halfway when a scream cut through the air. A scream full of terror, unmistakably human, coming from just ahead in the woods. We froze, heart racing. Without thinking, I rushed towards the sound. Benny and John followed me as we reached a clearing where bloodied clothes lay scattered on the ground. But there was no sign of the person who had screamed. We called out, but the forest was silent, holding its secrets tightly. Then we heard another scream, this time closer and unmistakably familiar. It was Pete and George. Our hearts pounded as we raced back to the path where we had left them. When we arrived, we found our friends were gone. Their belongings were scattered, but there was no sign of them. And then came another scream. It was George's voice. We turned and saw it. The same red-eyed creature Benny had described, charging straight at us. We ran, abandoning everything, the forest closing in around us. The path that had once been so familiar now felt like a trap. When we finally reached the car, we didn't stop to breathe until we were inside. The drive home was silent, the horror of what we had witnessed replaying in our minds. We reported our missing friends to the authorities, but their faces were unreadable, and the only thing they offered was disbelief. Our case was just another in a long string of disappearances linked to the forest. We clung to the hope that Pete and George were still alive, but without any real leads, we could only wait. As the days went by, our thoughts consumed us. The red-eyed deer seemed to haunt our every thought, every shadow, every breeze. We found ourselves returning to the edge of the forest, drawn to it by a morbid fascination. Every day, we searched for signs of Pete and George, but the forest seemed to close in on us, its silence mocking our efforts. The police were no help, their suspicion only adding to our frustration. But as time passed, we grew determined. The forest had taken our friends, and we weren't going to let it keep them. We ventured deeper into the woods, where we discovered strange markings on the trees and heard sounds that didn't belong. The forest was alive, in ways we hadn't expected, and we were determined to face it head-on. Days turned into weeks, and we became more familiar with the forest, but its mystery never left us. We couldn't stop, not until we had answers. The hunt for Pete and George was now a quest to confront the terror that had changed us all. Then one evening, after a long, fruitless search, we returned to the site of our first camping trip. It was eerily quiet now, the trees whispering secrets we couldn't understand. Suddenly, John froze, his eyes wide in terror. I turned to follow his gaze and saw them. Two glowing red eyes, peering at us from the darkening woods. The deer, it had returned. Fear gripped us and we ran. It chased us through the trees, its hooves echoing like thunder. As we fled, a scream cut through the air. It was Benny. I looked back and saw him crumpled on the ground, the creature looming over him. Desperation overtook me. I raised Benny's rifle and fired. The shot rang out, but the creature didn't flinch. It just stared at me. The camper and the open plains have always been my escape, my place of peace. But that night, everything was different. Pulling up to the campsite, I stepped out of my truck and immediately felt a deep connection to the wilderness. The air was crisp, almost charged, like it was alive. A chorus of owls hooting and crickets chirping welcomed me, creating a soothing soundtrack to the untouched landscape. I had left the noise of the city far behind, choosing instead to embrace the serene sounds of nature's most peaceful corners. Setting up my tent, I took a moment to appreciate the view. The ground I'd chosen was smooth and flat, nestled comfortably between strong trees that stretched their limbs toward the vast sky, scattered with stars. Gathering wood for the fire, I found myself absorbed in the rhythm of camping, each task a familiar routine that always brought me peace. With the tent ready and the fire crackling, I leaned back, soaking in the stillness. The isolation of the wild, the deep bond with nature, it was a meditative experience. There was no place I'd rather be, no better company than my own thoughts and the sounds of the forest. Then, from the quiet of the wilderness, a voice pierced the stillness. Help. I almost didn't hear it. The voice was so faint, it seemed to blend with the wind. I strained to listen. The crackling fire suddenly felt loud in comparison. The voice came again, this time clearer. Please help. It sounded like a woman's voice, but there was an odd echo to it, as if it came from deep within the woods. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight, its beams slicing through the darkness, but the forest remained quiet, hiding its secrets. The voice didn't come again, replaced instead by the usual night sounds, but it lingered in my mind. Maybe it was just the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me, I thought. But deep down, I knew it was real. I sat there, the weight of the forest pressing on me. Remembering my duty, I dialed the local police station and explained what had happened. I expected swift action, maybe even some reassurance. But the response I got was chilling. Sir, if you hear that voice again, ignore it. Do not respond. Do not approach. Their words echoed in my ears, turning the peaceful solitude I had sought into something unsettling. I had always found comfort in the silence of the woods, but now I realized even peaceful solitude could have a darker side. That was just the beginning of a night that would change everything. I had dealt with storms, wildlife, and all sorts of challenges on my camping trips, but never had I been told to ignore a cry for help. I stared at my phone, the officer's words repeating in my head. Ignore it. Don't respond. Don't approach. Was this how things were done out here? For a long moment, I sat there, unsure of what to do. A strange stillness had settled over the campsite, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, a group of local kids playing a twisted joke. People didn't just wander into the woods in the middle of the night, calling for help. Did they? I shook off the thought and hung up, trying to quiet my mind. But the officer's words stayed with me, haunting me in the flickering firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unknown. Was someone out there, lost and alone? The thought clung to me as the night wore on, and the fire slowly burned down to embers. I stayed alert, listening for any sounds out of place. The forest had resumed its usual rhythm, but the peace was gone. Every rustling leaf, every distant owl hoot, carried with it the echo of that voice. Help. Hours passed, and I lay in my tent, wide awake, straining to listen. The silence outside was thick, muffling all sound. I should have felt safe, protected by the quiet, but instead, I felt an uneasy sense of being watched. Suddenly, the voice came again, distant, but unmistakable. A soft plea carried through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, my earlier doubts now gone. There was definitely someone out there, but what was I supposed to do? The authorities had dismissed it. My gut told me to help, but the officer's warning rang in my mind, creating a terrible contrast to the urgent plea from the woods. I sat up, pulling my knees to my chest, my eyes darting around the dark tent. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The voice, soft and distant, came again, its desperate tone etched into my memory. I was torn between my instinct to help and the ominous advice from the police. The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no right choice. The unknown had come for me, and it was staring me in the face. As I lay there, the line between fear and duty blurred. I could no longer tell if I was afraid for my life or if I was just losing my grip on reality. The night stretched out around me, heavy and oppressive. Sleep was a distant thought, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The officer's words kept coming back. Ignore it. Do not respond. Do not approach. Just when I thought the night couldn't get stranger, a sound broke the silence. This one was different, closer, almost just outside my tent. My heart raced and I held my breath, listening. Help. The voice was close, nearly a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. It was the same plea, but now it felt far too close. My muscles tensed, and fear settled deep in my bones. I grabbed my flashlight, its faint beam my only anchor in the growing darkness. Just as I moved to open the tent flap, another voice stopped me. This voice was deeper, more commanding. No one's going to help you. My heart skipped a beat. A second voice, and this one sounded threatening. The night had just thrown another curveball at me, and the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see the whole picture. I reached for my phone again, hesitating. The officer's words still haunted me, but now I had to make a decision. I called again, my voice shaky. I called earlier about a voice asking for help. Now there's a second one. It's threatening. I explained the situation, and there was a long pause on the other end. Then the officer spoke, his tone tense. "Are you safe, sir? Leave the campsite immediately." I hung up, my blood running cold. This was more than a prank, more than a cry for help. The officer's voice had been full of concern, and I knew something was very wrong. But I couldn't back down. Someone needed help, and I had to find out who. I packed up quickly, deciding to leave at first light. But as I prepared to go, a sense of being watched clung to me. The forest, quiet now, seemed to close in around me. The events of the night had left a strange weight on my chest. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something more sinister at play? At dawn, I quickly dismantled camp, loading everything into my truck. The quiet campground mocked me. I had come for solitude, but I had found only fear and mystery. With a final glance at the now empty site, I started the truck and drove off, leaving the woods behind, but not the questions. Who had been calling for help? Why had the police reacted the way they did? What did they mean by their warnings? The drive home felt long and endless, my mind replaying every moment. Was it just a prank? Or had I stumbled upon something much darker? Even though I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't ignore the fear in the officer's voice. When I got home, I tried to return to normal, but the haunting echo of the voices stayed with me. Had I missed something? Was I to blame for not helping? 1 week later, Just as I was starting to convince myself that it had all been a dream, I heard it again. The same plea, now echoing inside my house. A cold shiver ran through me. The voice from the woods had followed me home. My home, once a place of safety, now felt alien, like something had seeped into the very walls. The voice seemed to move from room to room, always just out of sight. And then the second voice came again. No one's coming. This time, it wasn't just the words that froze me, but the realization that no one else knew. No one could help me now. I was trapped. Days turned into nights filled with restless fear. The voices never stopped, sometimes whispering, sometimes commanding. The sound of them was a constant reminder of the nightmare I was now living. One night, just past midnight, the female voice returned. This time it was different. "Help me?" It whispered, so close I could feel it on my ear. The moment I felt an icy touch on my shoulder, my blood ran cold. I turned, but no one was there. The voice was real, and it had followed me into my home. Fear took over, no longer about helping someone, but about surviving. This was no longer a mystery. This was my nightmare, and it was just beginning. The mountains always had a special draw for me. There was something about them, something grander than myself, something untouched and pure. It's why I decided to come out here alone, hoping to find some peace in the solitude these slopes seemed to offer. As I sat by the fire, its warmth glowing brightly, the evening wrapped itself around the world like a soft blanket. Twilight was settling in, and the night air filled with the rhythm of crickets chirping. These moments, simple and serene, were the ones I cherished most. Alone in the quiet, listening to nature's song as the campfire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. The embers floated up, reaching the stars above. I breathed in deeply, the scent of pines mixing with the cool mountain air. The sounds of the forest were a calming prelude to the quiet that would follow, a time where thoughts flowed freely. But within this calm, I felt an odd prickling sensation climb up my back, an all too familiar feeling. It was paranoia, one of those little tricks the mind sometimes plays on you. The cricket's song had faded, replaced by a strange hum, distant but persistent, echoing from the depths of the woods. It seemed to wrap itself around the camp, unsettling me. It felt off. I had known my share of hallucinations, tricks of the mind that twisted reality. But this was different. The hum felt real, tangible. I glanced into the blackness beyond the fire, searching for an explanation. The trees stood still, their secrets hidden by the dark, and yet, instinct told me something was wrong. But I forced myself to reason it out. The logical part of me suggested it was just fatigue, that it was nothing more than the echoes of a tired mind. Yes, that's all it was. I was exhausted from the long day and needed rest. So, I doused the fire, and the glowing embers hissed, dying down, leaving an unsettling darkness. The hum grew louder, like a sad ghost, but I told myself it was nothing, just my weary mind playing tricks. Shaking off the unease, I retreated to my tent. The canvas walls felt confining, but I reassured myself that they were a barrier between me and whatever fear lurked outside. I was safe. The hum was just the product of my fatigue. But as I nestled deeper into my sleeping bag, the hum only grew louder, ringing in my ears like a terrifying drum. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block it out, but it had already wormed its way into my mind. The ground beneath me trembled in time with the hum, and my nerves stood on edge. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the noise stopped. Abruptly, like a line had been drawn. Silence felt foreign now, heavy with the echo of the hum. Fear was no stranger to me, but this was different. This was terror. My heart raced, thumping in my chest, and I could feel it deep in my bones. I knew then that I had to leave to get to the car, to escape this wilderness. But fear rooted me in place. I couldn't move, trapped by the oppressive quiet, as though the night itself was pressing down on me. Outside, the darkness was thicker than before, the moon hiding itself, afraid to witness whatever horrors the forest held. Inside the thin walls of my tent, I was nothing more than prey. Tears slipped down my face, an unspoken admission of the fear clawing at me. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with panic. I felt small, insignificant, like a pawn in a game I couldn't understand. But exhaustion eventually took over. The fear, relentless as it had been, finally wore me out, and I fell into an uneasy sleep, hoping it was just a nightmare. Morning came, chasing away the remnants of the terror I'd felt. I awoke with a foggy mind, still half-dazed by the nightmare. I looked around, half expecting the hum to start again, but the silence was only that, quiet, still. I stepped outside into the warmth of the sun, a sharp contrast to the horrors of the previous night. The hum was gone, replaced by birdsong and the peaceful sights of the day. I tried to shake off the memory as I busied myself with camp chores, trying to find comfort in the familiar routine. But as the day wore on, the dread from the night before slowly crept back. The shadows lengthened, and the sounds of the forest began to shift. The hum returned, quiet at first, but unmistakable. My heart raced as I turned back to the campfire, feeling the chill crawl down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The nightmare wasn't over. I had to leave. I scrambled to pack my things, but fear distorted time. Each second seemed to drag, the hum rising in intensity as the ground beneath me seemed to vibrate. And then I saw it. A tall, pale figure, creeping toward me with unnerving grace, its presence amplifying the hum. I stood frozen for a moment before survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed my keys and fled toward the car, the figure close behind, its speed matching mine. I made it into the car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. The hum was louder now, a wall of sound protecting me as the figure halted, as if something invisible was keeping it at bay. I drove away, leaving the campsite, the figure, and my belongings behind. All that mattered now was escaping the nightmare, the horror of the mountains. As the city lights came into view, the hum faded into the distance, but its memory stayed with me. I parked outside my apartment, the familiar sights of the city a sharp contrast to the wildness of the forest. The trauma of the past days clung to me like a second skin. I washed the wound on my shoulder, a painful reminder of the terror I'd barely escaped. In the quiet of my apartment, sleep still eluded me. My mind replayed the events, the figure, the hum, and the fear that had seized me. Days passed, but the terror didn't leave. The city, with all its noise and bustle, couldn't drown out the memory. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the street, every flicker of light seemed to bring back the fear, as if the hum was still with me, just beyond the edge of my perception. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, I heard it again. The hum, low and soft, but unmistakable, threading its way through the sounds of the city. My heart stopped. Was it following me, or had it always been there, lurking in the background? The questions rushed back, but this time, I knew something. The hum had kept me safe in the forest. It had protected me from whatever that figure was. But why? As the night wore on, the hum remained, a constant reminder that the terror hadn't truly left. It had followed me, back into the city, into my home, a ghostly echo of the nightmare I couldn't escape. The mountains were no longer the sanctuary they once were. The terror had taken root in me, and now it was my constant companion, forever. In 2016, my friends and I had been wanting to go camping for a while at a local spot in the Sierra Madre National Park, which was about a 2-hour drive from where we lived. We had finally found the perfect weekend that worked for everyone's schedules, but just a few days before we were set to leave, we found out that an El Niño rainstorm was going to hit the area. Despite the bad weather, we weren't concerned and packed up the cars for our trip. The campsite was in a beautiful forest clearing, surrounded by about 100 campsites. We found a spot under some large, thick trees to shield us from the rain, and it helped that the restrooms were only a short walk away. With the weather clearing up for the moment, we quickly set up our camp. We placed our tents close together, just 6 feet apart. I had brought a big, thick blue tarp, measuring 20 feet by 20 feet, to put over the tents for extra rain protection. It worked well to keep us dry, but the tarp made a lot of noise whenever you moved around it, like walking on crinkling plastic. By the time evening came, we were sitting around the campfire, and I noticed that the site was unusually empty. Most of the people were staying in their RVs. I couldn't help but think they were the smart ones, unlike us, sleeping in tiny tents with just a tarp above us. I was tired from the day's work, so I decided to turn in early, and my friends followed suit. We set up the sleeping arrangements so that Ray slept in my tent, while AJ and S shared another. Before I fell asleep, I whispered to Ray that I was going to prank call AJ and S, but I wasn't going to say anything. Ray smiled as I dialed their number from a blocked line. S's phone rang, and I could hear their nervous voices as they discussed whether or not to answer. I let the call go unanswered, and Ray and I barely held in our laughter. I decided to call again. This time, when S picked up, I stayed silent and just breathed heavily into the phone, hoping to freak them out. After I hung up, I couldn't stop laughing, but I was stupid enough to call them a third time. This time, S answered immediately and said, "Look, if this is who I think it is, I'm calling the cops." Ray and I both laughed hard and mocked the situation with loud fake moans, causing AJ and S to yell at us angrily. Once I calmed down, I told them good night and promised I'd make pancakes for breakfast. I was out like a light, but the others stayed up for a while. I was the first to wake up the next morning and started making pancakes. The smell must have woken the others up, as they came out one by one. As we were eating, AJ spoke up and said, "Jay, that prank last night went a little too far. You had us ready to run to our car and leave." I felt a bit guilty and apologized. S then added, "Yeah, it's one thing to prank call us, but you walked around our tent and even went inside it." I didn't know what they meant, so I asked, "What are you talking about?" S said, "You were the one walking around our tent, and you went inside it." Ray spoke up, "It wasn't Jay. I thought it was you guys getting revenge on us." We were all confused at first, but Ray explained what had happened after I fell asleep. Apparently, about an hour after I had drifted off, Ray, AJ, and S heard footsteps on the blue tarp outside their tent. At first, they thought it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy. The person walked in circles around the tents and even ran fingers along the fabric walls. The footsteps stopped right between their tent doors, and for a long moment, there was complete silence. Then, the zipper of the tent door opened halfway. In the darkness, S and AJ could make out a man's face peering in at them. They both pretended to sleep, but they kept their eyes on him as he opened the tent and walked in. He didn't say anything, just stood at the entrance staring at them. After what felt like forever, he walked out and the footsteps faded into the night. At breakfast, we were interrupted by a man approaching our campsite. He greeted us with a raspy voice and asked how we had slept. He wore a faded, stained t-shirt and old jeans, and smelled strongly of alcohol, even though it was only 8 a.m. He mumbled something about needing cigarettes, and we told him we didn't smoke. He then invited us to check out his RV, saying it was for sale. We politely declined, but he didn't seem to take the hint. The man then walked toward the restrooms, and after a while returned to our campsite. This time, he just gave us a strange smile before heading back to his RV. We took note of the RV. It was in bad shape, much older and more run down than the others. S and AJ also recalled that they had smelled liquor when the man was standing near their tent. We all agreed to keep an eye on him and warned each other that if he made any more strange moves, we'd report him to the park rangers. By mid-afternoon, the man came back to talk to us again, offering his RV for sale once more. This time, his tone was more persistent, but I gave him a firm no thanks, and he walked off. A few hours later, the man left the campsite, but we noticed he kept glancing back at us. His RV was parked about 50 yards from ours, and it had its own bathroom right next to it. We were all curious as to why he had walked all the way over to use our restroom, especially when his RV had one. At least he was finally gone, and we hoped the rest of the weekend would go smoothly. This happened about 4 years ago when my boyfriend and I were still getting to know each other. My sister suggested a snorkeling trip as something fun to do together. It was at a quarry surrounded by a campground, filled with water, and known for its crystal clear waters and diving. People dive down to see a helicopter and a school bus. My boyfriend and I decided to camp overnight. When we checked in, we both had a bad feeling about the place but kept it to ourselves until later. First, everything seemed great. We snorkeled in the shallow parts of the quarry, and while the depth was a little unnerving, I was still enjoying myself. The water was 65 feet deep, so once you swam out of the shallow area, it dropped off suddenly and became pitch black. It was in this moment I realized just how scared I was of deep, dark water. There's something unsettling about a lake that's perfectly still. I guess it's because the quarry doesn't have a current. Afterward, my boyfriend and I were winding down back at our campsite. We were camping on a grassy spot down a hill from the road, with our tent set up in a wooded area extending from the campsite. Across the green, there was another campsite that looked lived in, but our neighbors weren't there at the time. We were cooking hot dogs over the fire when they arrived. It was dark now, and they immediately went to sleep. About 20 to 30 minutes later, things started to get eerie. We were talking when we noticed a shadowy figure watching us from up the hill. Because of the fire's glow, we couldn't see its details, but we could tell it was staring directly at us, almost hiding behind our neighbor's truck. It watched us for what felt like a long time before it started walking down the road. We silently watched it walk behind trees, the same ones that connected to our campsite. Each time I thought I'd see it step out from behind one of the trees, it did, about 4 or 5 times. It wasn't until later that I realized it had stopped walking or was hiding behind one of the trees. I was really freaked out, wondering where the figure had gone. I saw my boyfriend looking at me, probably thinking the same thing, but he just shrugged it off, and I naively did too. Eventually, we forgot about it and went to the quarry late at night. The stars reflecting off the water were beautiful, but the pitch-black water was terrifying. We returned to our campsite, crawled into our tent, and relaxed. I soon began to feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just exhaustion. After a few moments of silence, my boyfriend asked, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" I responded, "Why would you say that?" half joking but fully scared. My boyfriend suggested we leave the tent, so we stood by my car. I came up with the odd idea that standing in the middle of the field would be the safest spot, thinking that if anyone was coming, we'd see them first. As we were walking in the field, we noticed the same shadowy figure from before, standing about 20 yards away. We both saw it and realized it was walking in the same direction as us. We changed directions, and so did the figure. We agreed that if it followed us again, we'd run to the car. We changed course, and sure enough, it followed. We ran to my car, and I watched it slowly walk back into the darkness while still staring at us. My boyfriend then said, let's get out of here. And I agreed, but all our camping gear was outside. We quietly packed up, trying not to freak each other out. The weirdest part, though, happened next. My headlights weren't working, and there was a strange fog on my windshield that wouldn't go away no matter what we tried. We had to drive out of the woods with only the low beams on, barely able to see anything. The fog disappeared the second we got to the gas station. We arrived home around 1 a.m. The next day, I told my dad the story, and he said he was glad we got out of there. Apparently, 2 people had died at that campground while snorkeling, which I found out after we returned. My boyfriend, and I think it was either someone trying to harm us or possibly a skinwalker. We've kind of settled on the skinwalker theory because what happened was so hard to explain.